Maya, when people hear you inherited a 500-year-old house, they probably picture dusty antiques and maybe some family photos. What did you actually find when you first walked through those doors?
Tony, I expected cobwebs and creaky floorboards, maybe some old furniture worth selling. Instead, I found my grandmother's biggest secret. The first room I entered had this shimmering doorway that definitely wasn't there in any childhood photos. When I stepped through, I wasn't in England anymore. I was standing in what looked like a medieval marketplace, with people in robes speaking languages I'd never heard. It took me 3 hours to find my way back to the house. That's when I realized Grandma hadn't just left me a property. She'd left me a responsibility.
But how do you even begin to turn something that extraordinary into a business?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Maya, when you first inherited your grandmother's estate, what was your initial impression when you walked through those heavy oak doors?
Long pause. Oh, Tony, I'll never forget that moment. The smell hit me first. Centuries of wood polish mixed with something I couldn't quite place, like dried herbs and old parchment. The foyer stretched up 3 stories, with this grand staircase that curved like a spine. Every step I took echoed, as if the house was announcing my arrival to ghosts I couldn't see.
Your grandmother, tell me about her. She lived in that house for how long?
Nearly 70 years. She moved there as a young bride in the 1950s. Can you imagine? This massive 16th century estate. Just her and my grandfather rattling around in rooms that had housed nobility centuries before. She used to say the house chose its inhabitants, not the other way around.
That's quite a perspective. Did you spend much time there as a child?
Every summer until I was about 12. Then something changed. Grandmother became more protective, more secretive. She'd close off entire wings, claiming they were unsafe. I remember pressing my ear to locked doors, hearing the strangest sounds, like wind chimes in a breeze, but there was no wind inside.
How did that make you feel as a curious child?
Frustrated, certainly. But also thrilled, if I'm being honest. There's something intoxicating about a mystery, especially when you're young. I used to sketch floor plans from memory, trying to map out the forbidden areas. My grandmother would find these drawings and her face would go pale. She'd gather them up without a word.
When she passed, were you surprised to inherit the property?
Completely stunned. We'd grown apart over the years. My fault, really. Career, marriage, raising children. You know how life pulls you in different directions. I assumed she'd leave everything to the Historical Society, or perhaps distant cousins in Scotland.
But instead you found yourself holding the keys to a 500-year-old mystery.
Exactly. The lawyer handed me this ornate iron key, not a modern copy, but something that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. He mentioned that your grandmother left specific instructions about certain rooms, certain areas you were to explore only when you felt ready.
That must have been both exciting and unnerving.
Tony, I drove up that winding gravel drive with my heart pounding like a teenager's. The house loomed against the September sky, all those chimneys and gabled windows watching me approach. It looked exactly as I remembered, yet somehow more imposing, as if it had been waiting.
Walk me through those first few days of exploration. Perfect sense. Old houses have their own personalities. What did you discover about the property's history?
Grandmother left me boxes of documents, deeds, letters, architectural drawings dating back centuries. The house was built by Sir Edmund Blackwood in 1547, but the land itself has an older history. There are mentions of a monastery, stone circles, something the locals called the Threshold Grounds.
Threshold Grounds. That's an intriguing name.
Isn't it? According to the historical records, people in the village always considered the property a crossing point. Shepherds reported losing sheep that would reappear weeks later, perfectly healthy but somehow changed. The wool was different, colors that didn't exist in our region.
How did you react to reading these accounts?
With skepticism, naturally. I'm a practical woman, Tony. I ran a consulting firm for 30 years. But there's something about sitting in a candlelit library at midnight, surrounded by centuries of carefully documented testimonies, that makes you question what's possible.
Tell me about the moment you first discovered something truly unusual.
Pause. It was my 4th day there. I was measuring rooms for renovation estimates when I noticed discrepancies in the eastern wing. According to my measurements, there should have been a 30-foot gap between 2 rooms, but from the outside, the walls appeared continuous.
You found hidden spaces.
Behind a bookshelf in what I thought was a reading nook, I discovered a lever disguised as a decorative rose carving. When I pressed it, a section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. No creaking, no resistance, as if it had been maintained regularly.
What lay beyond that hidden door?
A corridor I'd never seen before, lit by some source I couldn't identify. Not electric lights, not candles, but a soft pearl-like glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The air was different too, fresher, with hints of pine and morning mist.
That must have been overwhelming.
I stood there for at least 10 minutes, Maya, just trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some dusty priest hole or forgotten storage room. This was something actively maintained, as if grandmother had been caring for it right up until she passed.
Did you venture down that corridor?
Not immediately. I'm cautious by nature. But I could hear something at the far end. Not threatening sounds, but almost musical, like distant laughter and church bells mixed with what might have been market vendors calling their wares.
Sounds from another time and place.
That's exactly what they were, though I couldn't have known it then. I retreated, closed the passage, and spent the evening researching the house's architectural history. But those sounds haunted me, Tony. They felt more real than the silence of my empty inheritance.
When did you finally follow that corridor to its end?
The next morning, armed with a flashlight and my phone, though neither proved necessary. The corridor stretched about 50 yards before opening into a circular chamber with 3 archways. Each one hummed with that same pearl light, but beyond each arch lay something impossible.
Describe what you saw through those archways.
Long pause. Through the first, I glimpsed a medieval marketplace, bustling with activity. People in period clothing bartering over goods I recognized from museum displays. Through the second, a futuristic cityscape with crystalline spires reaching toward purple skies. The third opened onto a forest glade where the trees themselves seemed to glow with inner light.
How long did you stand there trying to rationalize what you were seeing?
Hours, Tony. I convinced myself I was experiencing stress hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning, anything that might explain windows into other worlds existing in my grandmother's basement. But the more I watched, the more details I noticed that no hallucination could provide.
What kind of details?
In the medieval scene, I watched a baker pull loaves from an oven and noticed the specific way steam rose in the cool morning air. A child chased a chicken between market stalls, laughing as it knocked over a basket of apples. These weren't vague impressions. They were fully realized worlds with weather, smells, sounds.
Did you attempt to make contact or pass through?
Not that first day. But I found myself returning to that chamber repeatedly, watching these other worlds like television programs. Except they weren't programs. They were alive, dynamic, unpredictable. I began to recognize recurring figures, daily rhythms, seasonal changes.
It sounds almost addictive.
It was in the most wonderful way. Here I was, a woman facing an empty nest and uncertain future, suddenly granted access to infinite possibilities. But it was also terrifying, Tony. What obligations came with such knowledge? What responsibilities?
Did you find any guidance from your grandmother's papers?
Eventually. Hidden in a false bottom of her desk, I discovered a leather journal written in her careful handwriting. She'd known about the passages her entire time in the house. More than known. She'd been their guardian, their protector.
Protector from what?
According to her notes, the passages are ancient, far older than the house built around them. They require careful management to remain stable. Without proper attention, they could either seal permanently or worse, spiral out of control, and create unwanted connections.
Unwanted connections to where?
Pause places where humans aren't welcome, Tony. Grandmother's journal mentioned several close calls over the decades, times when the passages tried to open onto worlds too dangerous or unstable for contact. She'd learned techniques for guiding their destinations, like tuning a radio to specific frequencies.
So she was actively managing these interdimensional doorways.
For 70 years. Can you imagine the dedication, the secrecy? She could never share this wonder with anyone, never seek help or advice. Just her, alone with the greatest discovery in human history, treating it like a family heirloom that needed regular polishing.
How did that realization change your perspective on your inheritance?
Everything shifted, Tony. This wasn't just about renovating an old house or preserving family history. I'd inherited a responsibility that could impact multiple worlds, multiple realities. The weight of that was almost paralyzing.
But you didn't walk away.
Soft laugh, could you have? Once you've seen proof that infinite wonders exist just beyond reach, how do you return to worrying about quarterly reports and weekend plans? Besides, grandmother chose me for this. She must have believed I could handle it.
What convinced you to take the first step through one of those archways?
Curiosity finally overcame caution. The medieval marketplace seemed safest, familiar, even if from a different era. One morning I simply stepped through the arch and found myself standing on cobblestones, breathing air that smelled of bread baking and horses working.
And nobody questioned your presence, your clothing, your sudden appearance?
That's where I learned the passages have their own magic. I looked down and found myself dressed appropriately for the time and place. My modern clothes had transformed into period-appropriate garb. Even more remarkably, I could understand and speak their language perfectly.
The passages adapt their travelers to fit each destination.
Precisely. It's as if they want to facilitate connection rather than create barriers. Within minutes, I was sampling honey cakes and discussing weather patterns with a merchant who thought I was from the next village over.
That must have been an extraordinary experience.
Life-changing, Tony. But also the moment I realized this gift was too wonderful to keep to myself.
So Maya, you've given us this incredible overview of how you discovered the portals, but I'm fascinated by the house itself. Can you paint a picture for our listeners of what you first encountered when you stepped through that front door?
Long pause. Oh, Tony, where do I even begin? The smell hit me first. Centuries of dampness, rotting timber, and something else I couldn't identify at the time. Later I realized it was the lingering scent of magic itself, like ozone after a thunderstorm mixed with ancient parchment. The floorboards groaned under every step, and I remember thinking the whole structure might collapse if I breathed too hard.
Your grandmother had been gone for how long before you inherited?
Nearly 15 years. She'd moved to assisted living when I was in my 30s, and the house had been sitting empty all that time. Can you imagine? 15 years of neglect on a structure that was already 4.5 centuries old. The wallpaper was peeling in great sheets, hanging like dead skin. Windows were cracked or missing entirely. I walked into that front parlor and saw daylight streaming through gaps in the roof.
What did you know about your grandmother's relationship with the house? Had she ever mentioned anything unusual about it?
That's what's so extraordinary, Tony. She was always secretive about her past, about the family history. I knew the house had been in our family for generations, but she'd get this distant look whenever I asked about it. She'd say things like, "Old houses hold old secrets, dear," and then change the subject. I thought she was just being mysterious for the sake of it. You know how some elderly relatives can be?
But there must have been hints, surely.
Laughed softly looking back. Absolutely. She had this collection of what I thought were costume jewelry, ornate pendants and rings that seemed to shimmer with their own light. And her stories. God, her stories. She'd tell me tales about distant relatives who disappeared for months at a time, only to return with strange knowledge and speaking in tongues no one recognized. I thought they were fairy tales.
When you first started exploring the house, what rooms made the strongest impression on you?
The library stopped me dead in my tracks. 3 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves, with one of those rolling ladders you see in old universities. But Tony, these weren't normal books. Some were bound in materials I couldn't identify, scales that caught light like jewels, leather that felt warm to the touch. And the titles. I remember one clearly, Traversing the Infinite Corridors, a practical guide. At the time, I assumed it was some Victorian travel manual.
And the basement? That's where you found the first portal, correct? Describe that moment when you first realized what you were looking at wasn't just architectural decoration.
I'd been down there maybe a dozen times, each visit working up more courage to explore deeper. On this particular afternoon, I was examining what I thought was a decorative archway in the furthest chamber. The stones were arranged in this perfect circle, about 7 feet in diameter, and covered in those intricate carvings. I reached out to trace one of the symbols with my finger, and suddenly the air inside the archway began to shimmer.
What went through your mind in that moment?
Panic, honestly. I thought I was having some kind of breakdown. The shimmer intensified until it looked like heat waves rising from summer pavement, except vertical. Then gradually, I could make out shapes forming on the other side, rolling green hills under a sky that was definitely not the gray October afternoon I'd left behind upstairs.
How long did you stand there, just watching?
It felt like hours, but probably only minutes. I remember my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give out. The air coming through the portal was warm and carried the scent of wildflowers and something cooking. Bread, I think. I could hear sounds too, distant voices speaking in what might have been Old English, and the clop of horse hooves on cobblestones.
When you finally worked up the courage to investigate further, what did you discover about the portal's destination?
Pause. That first world was what I later learned was a fairly accurate representation of 16th century England, but without the disease and poverty. It was like stepping into an idealized version of the Tudor period. The people there, and yes, there were people, real inhabitants, welcomed me as if interdimensional visitors were perfectly normal. They called their realm Avalonia, and explained it existed parallel to our Earth's history.
How did you process that information, learning that these weren't just magical doorways but gateways to populated dimensions?
I didn't process it well initially, Tony. I spent weeks convincing myself I'd had some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and the house's overwhelming atmosphere. But the evidence kept mounting. I'd find mud on my shoes that didn't match anything in our area, rich, dark soil with traces of plants that don't grow in New England. And I started having dreams about places I'd never been, conversations with people who felt more real than most folks I encounter in daily life.
What finally convinced you to embrace what was happening rather than fight it?
My grandmother's journal. I found it hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace mantel. Page after page documenting portal locations, destination worlds, even sketches of the inhabitants she'd met. She'd been visiting these places for 60 years, Tony. She wrote about her responsibility as guardian, about maintaining the balance between worlds. The final entry was addressed to me specifically.
What did she say?
Voice becoming emotional. She wrote, "My dearest Maya, if you're reading this, then the house has accepted you as my successor. These doorways are not a burden, but a gift. You have the opportunity to build bridges between worlds, to create understanding where there has been separation. Trust your instincts, trust the house, and trust that this responsibility found you for a reason."
That must have been overwhelming, to suddenly understand your grandmother had been living this extraordinary double life.
It reframed everything about her, about our family's history, about my own purpose. But it also explained why the house never sold, why it waited empty for 15 years until I was ready. The structure itself seemed to be testing me, gradually revealing its secrets as I proved worthy of them.
Were there signs that other family members had known about the portals?
Absolutely. Once I knew what to look for, I found evidence everywhere. Portrait subjects wearing jewelry that matched artifacts I'd discovered in the house's hidden compartments. Family documents referencing extended travels that lasted months, but with no record of actual departures. Even some of the house's architectural features, windows positioned to overlook portal chambers, ventilation systems designed to accommodate air exchange between dimensions.
Looking back now, do you think your grandmother was preparing you for this inheritance in ways you didn't recognize at the time?
Thoughtful pause, absolutely. She encouraged my travel, my studies in history and archaeology. She'd test my problem-solving abilities with these elaborate puzzles and riddles. And she always emphasized the importance of hospitality, of making strangers feel welcome and safe. Skills I'd need in abundance once I started receiving interdimensional guests.
Maya, when you first walked through that front door 3 months ago, what did you actually see? I mean, before all of this started happening.
Long pause, Tony. You have to understand. I'd been dreading that moment for weeks. The house had been sitting empty since Grandmother Eleanor passed, and everyone in the family just assumed it would need to be torn down. When I turned that heavy iron key and stepped inside, The smell hit me first.
What kind of smell?
Old wood, dust, but underneath that something else. Something almost sweet, like flowers that had been pressed between book pages for decades. The afternoon light was streaming through those tall windows, illuminating all these dancing dust motes, and I could see the bones of what the place used to be. These gorgeous oak beams running across the ceiling, carved newel posts on the staircase.
But it wasn't in good condition.
Oh, heavens no. Plaster was cracked and peeling everywhere. Some of the floorboards were so warped you could see daylight between them. The kitchen still had that old cast-iron stove from probably the 1920s, and there were birds nesting in what used to be the pantry. But Tony, even in that state, there was something about the proportions of the rooms, the way the light moved through the space.
You mentioned your grandmother, Eleanor. How well did you know her?
That's the strange thing. Growing up, she was always this mysterious figure. My mother would take me to visit maybe twice a year, and grandmother Eleanor would serve tea in these delicate china cups and tell the most incredible stories. Stories about the house's history, about the original family who built it in 1523.
What kind of stories?
She'd talk about Sir William Ashford, who commissioned the house after returning from his travels abroad. She said he'd seen things in distant lands that changed his perspective on what was possible. She described the elaborate dinner parties they used to host, with guests arriving from all over Europe. Sometimes she'd mention strange visitors, people who spoke languages no one recognized.
Did you believe these stories as a child?
Laugh softly. You know how children are, Tony. Part of me believed every word, and part of me thought she was just a wonderful storyteller with an active imagination. But there was something in her eyes when she talked about the house. This knowing look, like she was sharing secrets she wasn't supposed to tell.
When did you realize there might be more to those stories? Symbols?
Geometric shapes, spirals, some that looked almost like star charts. And Maya, as I was tracing one of these patterns with my finger, trying to understand what I was looking at, the air in the room seemed to shimmer.
Shimmer?
Like heat waves rising from summer pavement, except it was October and quite cool in the house. Just for a moment, maybe 3 seconds, I could have sworn I heard music, not from any radio or device, but distant, as if it was coming from somewhere very far away.
What did you do?
Pause. Honestly, Tony, I convinced myself I was just tired. I'd been working 12-hour days, sleeping on an air mattress in the one room where the roof wasn't leaking. Stress and exhaustion can play tricks on your mind. But that night, when I was lying there trying to fall asleep, I kept thinking about something grandmother Eleanor used to say.
Which was?
She'd always tell me the house had good bones, but more than that, she'd say it had a good memory. That places where people had lived and loved and dreamed for centuries, they held on to something of all those experiences. I used to think she was being poetic.
And now?
Now I think she was being remarkably precise. Tony, this house has seen 500 years of human stories. The Ashfords lived here for 3 generations. Then the Pemberton family for nearly 2 centuries, each family leaving their mark, their energy, their dreams embedded in these walls.
You mentioned Sir William's travels. Did your grandmother ever elaborate on where he'd been?
She'd hint at things. Said he'd spent time in the Ottoman Empire, in places where scholars preserved knowledge that had been lost elsewhere. She mentioned he'd brought back books, artifacts, things that influenced how he designed certain rooms in the house.
The rooms where you later discovered the unusual features?
Quietly, yes. The morning room with those symbols, the library with its peculiar acoustics, and the tower room, Tony, which I didn't even attempt to enter until my 3rd week there. Grandmother Eleanor always said that room was special, that it was where Sir William did his most important work.
What kind of work?
She never said directly, but she'd talk about him being a natural philosopher. Someone who believed that understanding the true nature of reality required looking beyond what most people accepted as possible. She said he designed the house as a kind of instrument.
An instrument for what?
Long pause for seeing, Tony. For understanding connections that exist between places, between times, between what we think of as separate worlds. I thought it was just an old woman's romantic notion about her ancestral home. But those symbols on the floor, the way certain rooms seemed to hold echoes of something larger, the sensation that the house itself was somehow aware of my presence.
Aware?
I know how it sounds. But after 2 weeks of working alone in that space, paying attention to its rhythms, its creaks and settling sounds, I started to feel like I was in conversation with something. Something patient and benevolent, but definitely present.
And that's when things began to change?
That's when I finally understood what Grandmother Eleanor had been trying to tell me all those years. The house wasn't just a place to live, Tony. It was a doorway.
So Maya, you mentioned earlier that you'd been working on the house for about 3 weeks when everything changed. Can you walk me through what happened that day?
Long pause. I remember it so clearly, Tony. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was down in what I thought was just another storage room in the basement. I'd been putting off exploring that particular area because the door was so warped and difficult to open.
What made you finally decide to tackle that room?
The contractor I'd hired to assess the foundation kept insisting we needed to examine every space before we could move forward with the structural work. I'd been procrastinating because, honestly, I was already overwhelmed by everything else I'd found. But that morning I just thought, let's get this over with.
And when you finally got that door open?
At first it looked like any other basement room. Stone walls, cobwebs, that musty smell you'd expect after 5 centuries. But there was something odd about the far wall. The stones were arranged differently, almost like they formed some kind of pattern.
What kind of pattern are we talking about?
It's hard to describe, Tony. Imagine if someone had taken ordinary fieldstone and arranged it into what looked almost like a doorway, but not quite. The stones seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. I thought maybe it was just the way my flashlight was hitting them.
So what did you do?
Well, my first instinct was to touch the wall, see if the stones were loose or if there was some kind of moisture causing that shimmer effect. The moment my hand made contact with the center stone, everything changed.
Changed how?
The shimmer intensified, and suddenly what had looked like solid stone became transparent. I could see through it, Tony, like looking through a window. But what I was seeing on the other side was impossible.
Tell me what you saw.
A meadow. Green grass swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. Wildflowers I'd never seen before. And a sky that was somehow both familiar and completely alien. The light was different, softer but more vibrant at the same time. And in the distance, I could make out what looked like a small village with buildings that seemed to be made of crystal or glass.
How long did you stand there looking through this window? What kind of sounds?
Wind chimes, maybe, or something like music, but played on instruments I couldn't identify. And there were voices, Tony. Distant, but definitely voices speaking in a language I'd never heard before.
That must have been terrifying.
You know, that's what surprised me most about my reaction. I should have been terrified, should have run upstairs and called someone, anyone. But instead I felt this overwhelming sense of curiosity mixed with something I can only describe as recognition.
Recognition?
As if some part of me had been expecting this. Not consciously, of course, but somewhere deeper. Like finding a room in your house that you'd forgotten existed. Except the room was an entire other world.
Did you try to go through?
Not that first day. I was brave enough to stick my hand through, and I could feel the breeze from that other place, could smell what reminded me of jasmine and something spicier I couldn't name. But stepping through entirely? That took me 3 more days to work up the courage for.
3 days of knowing this existed in your basement. How did you function during those 3 days?
Barely, Tony. I'd go down there every few hours just to make sure it was still there, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail I could remember, sketching what I saw. I think part of me was trying to convince myself it was real, and part of me was hoping I'd find some logical explanation.
Did you consider telling anyone?
Who would I tell? My children already thought I'd lost my mind moving into this place. If I'd called them and said I'd found a portal to another dimension in the basement, they'd have had me committed by evening.
So you dealt with this completely alone?
For those first few days, yes. And it was during those days that I started noticing other things about the house I'd previously dismissed.
What kind of things?
Sounds that didn't quite make sense for an empty house. Glimpses of light under doors when I knew I hadn't left any lights on. And the dreams, Tony. Every night I'd dream about walking through doorways into places that felt as real as anywhere I'd ever been.
Were these the same places you could see through the portal?
Some were, but others were completely different. Medieval castles, cities that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies, forests where the trees seemed to glow with their own inner light. Each dream felt like a memory rather than something my mind was creating.
When you finally decided to step through that first portal, what convinced you to take that leap?
Pause. It was something my grandmother had written in one of her journals. I found the entry on the 4th day, and it changed everything I thought I knew about her, about the house, and about why she'd really left it to me.
What did she write?
That's when I realized this had all happened before, Tony, and that I wasn't the first person in my family to stand in that basement, staring at an impossible doorway to another world.
So, Maya, you mentioned earlier that the renovation was going smoothly for those first few weeks. When did things start to change?
Long pause. It was a Tuesday morning in early October. I remember because the leaves were just starting to turn, and I'd been looking forward to seeing how the old oak trees would look from the upper windows once I got them properly cleaned.
What happened that morning that was different?
I was working in what I thought was going to be the main guest room on the 2nd floor. Beautiful space, Tony, with these incredible hand-carved wooden panels along the walls. I'd been scraping away layers of old wallpaper when I noticed something odd about one particular panel.
Odd how?
It was warm. Not just room temperature warm, but actually warm to the touch. Like there was a heating element behind it, except the house had no electricity running to that room yet.
That must have been unsettling.
At first I thought maybe it was some kind of solar heating effect, you know? Old houses can have strange thermal properties. But when I pressed against it to test the wood stability, the entire panel shifted inward.
Shifted? You mean it moved?
About 6 inches, like it was on some kind of hinge mechanism. And Tony, the moment it moved, I heard something that made my blood run cold.
What did you hear?
Voices, clear as day, speaking in what sounded like Old English. Not recordings, not echoes from outside, fresh voices, having a conversation somewhere behind that wall.
How did you react to that?
Nervous laugh. Well, my first instinct was to run. I mean, there I am, alone in this massive old house, and suddenly I'm hearing medieval conversations coming from inside the walls. But then I heard something that stopped me cold.
What was that?
One of the voices mentioned my grandmother's name. Not her married name that I knew her by, but her maiden name. Elizabeth Hartwell, a name I'd only seen once in some very old family documents.
That must have given you chills.
Chills doesn't begin to cover it, Tony. I stood there for what felt like hours, just listening. The voices were discussing something about the keeper's granddaughter and whether I was ready for the responsibility.
Did you try to respond? To let them know you could hear them? What happened next?
The panel suddenly clicked back into place on its own, just slid right back flush with the wall like nothing had happened. The warmth disappeared, the voices stopped. Everything went back to normal.
How long did you stay in that room afterward?
I didn't. I grabbed my tools and got out of there as fast as I could. Spent the rest of the day working on the kitchen plumbing, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing.
But you didn't really believe that, did you?
No, I didn't. That night I called my cousin Rebecca, the one who'd helped me sort through grandmother's belongings. I asked her if she'd ever heard any family stories about the house being, well, unusual.
What did Rebecca tell you?
Pause. She got very quiet for a long time. Then she said something that changed everything. She told me that grandmother had made her promise never to mention it, unless I asked directly. But there were family legends about the house being a crossing point.
A crossing point?
That's exactly what I asked. Rebecca said the old stories claimed our family had been guardians of doorways between worlds for centuries. She'd always assumed they were just fairy tales.
How did that conversation leave you feeling?
Terrified and fascinated in equal measure. Part of me wanted to pack up and sell the house immediately, but another part, the part that had always felt drawn to that place, knew I had to go back to that panel.
Did you sleep at all that night?
Not a wink. I kept thinking about those voices, about grandmother never really explaining why she'd left the house empty for so many years, about all the times she'd look at me with this knowing expression when I was a child.
It sounds like you were starting to realize this inheritance came with more than just property taxes and renovation costs.
Soft laugh, that's putting it mildly, Tony. I was beginning to understand that grandmother hadn't just left me a house. She'd left me a responsibility that went back 500 years.
Maya, I imagine those first few days after discovering the portals must have been overwhelming. How did you even begin to process what you were dealing with?
Long pause. You know, Tony, I think I went through something like the stages of grief. First there was denial. I kept telling myself I was hallucinating from all the dust and old house fumes. Then anger, because how dare my grandmother leave me with this impossible situation without any warning or instructions.
And yet you didn't run away. You didn't sell the house immediately or call it quits. What kept you there?
Honestly, stubbornness. Soft laugh, my late husband used to say I was too pig-headed to know when I was beaten. But there was something else, too. Standing in that library, watching sunlight from 3 different worlds streaming through those doorways, it felt like the house had been waiting for me my whole life.
That's beautifully put. But I have to ask, weren't you terrified? Most people would have been running for the hills.
Oh, I was terrified. Absolutely petrified. But you have to understand, Tony, at 62 I'd already lost so much. My husband, my mother, my old career when the company downsized. Fear becomes a different thing when you've weathered real loss. This strange new fear felt almost exciting by comparison.
You mentioned your husband. How do you think he would have reacted to all this?
Pause. Richard would have loved it. He was the dreamer in our marriage, always talking about parallel universes and what-if scenarios. I was the practical one, keeping our feet on the ground. Sometimes I wonder if finding these portals was my way of finally joining him in that sense of wonder he always carried.
That's a profound way to honor his memory. But let's talk about the practical challenges. You're dealing with guests from other dimensions now. How did you even begin to establish basic safety protocols?
Trial and error mostly, and a few close calls that still make my heart race. There was this businessman from a steampunk Victorian world who nearly poisoned himself drinking our regular tap water. Apparently, his dimension had adapted to different mineral content over the centuries.
How did you handle that crisis?
Pure instinct, and a lot of chamomile tea. Chuckles. I sat with him for 6 hours, monitoring his breathing, forcing fluids, and talking him through it. That's when I realized I wasn't just running a bed and breakfast. I was becoming some kind of interdimensional nurse and cultural ambassador.
That sounds incredibly isolating. Were you handling all of this alone?
Completely alone, yes. And that was probably the hardest part, Tony. Not the magic or the danger, but having no one to share it with. I'd call my sister sometimes, start to tell her about my day, then catch myself. How do you casually mention that you served breakfast to a talking fox from an enchanted forest? Long pause. I started talking to the house, full conversations, asking the walls for advice, telling the portraits about my day. I know how that sounds, but the house felt alive, like it was listening, responding in its own way.
And was it? Responding, I mean?
Sometimes doors would open when I needed them to, or I'd find exactly the right book fallen open to the perfect page in my grandmother's library. Coincidence, maybe. But when you're that alone with something that extraordinary, you start to believe in more than coincidence.
You've mentioned your grandmother's library several times. Did you find any answers there about what you'd inherited?
Bits and pieces. Her journals were cryptic, written in a mixture of languages and what I can only call dimensional shorthand. But slowly, I started understanding that she'd been doing this for decades. Quietly, carefully, but she'd been helping travelers move between worlds.
How did that revelation change your perspective on your grandmother?
Everything I thought I knew about her shifted. This woman I'd seen as a sweet, eccentric old lady had been running the most extraordinary operation in human history, and she'd been completely alone with that secret, just like I was.
Did that realization make you feel closer to her, even after her passing?
Voice softening. It made me understand why she chose me, Tony. Not because I was the most qualified or the most prepared, but because she knew I'd learned how to carry something heavy without breaking under the weight. She saw that loneliness and responsibility weren't strangers to me.
That's a remarkable legacy to inherit alongside magical portals.
Sometimes I think the real inheritance wasn't the house or the magic. It was learning that some of us are meant to be bridges between worlds, even when it means standing alone in the space between them.
Maya, I have to ask about something that's been on my mind since our last conversation. When you first discovered those portals, you mentioned feeling overwhelmed. How did you cope with such a dramatic shift in your understanding of reality?
Long pause. You know, Tony, I think that's when I realized how much of my grandmother's wisdom I'd dismissed as folklore. She used to tell me stories about doors that led to other worlds, and I'd smile politely, thinking it was just her way of making an old house seem magical to a child.
That must have been a profound moment of reckoning. Tell me about those early days when you were trying to process what you'd inherited.
The first week after I found the library portal, I barely slept. I'd sit in that dusty armchair, staring at where the bookshelf had swung open, wondering if I was losing my mind. I called my sister 3 times, almost telling her everything, then hanging up before the words came out.
What held you back from sharing this discovery with family?
Fear, mostly. Fear that they'd think I needed professional help, or worse, that they'd want to sell the house immediately. This place had been falling apart for decades. If I told them it was full of magical doorways, they'd either commit me or turn it into some sort of carnival attraction.
So you carried this burden alone initially?
Voice softening for about 2 weeks, yes. I kept detailed journals, documenting every portal I found, mapping where they led. The medieval realm was the second one I discovered, hidden behind what looked like a wine cellar door. When I stepped through and saw those rolling hills, the castle in the distance, I actually sat down in the grass and wept.
What brought on those tears, Maya?
It was beautiful, yes, but it was also terrifying. I realized my entire life was about to change, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough for that kind of transformation. I'd spent 47 years as a high school English teacher, living a quiet, predictable life. Suddenly, I was responsible for doorways to other dimensions.
How did you find the strength to move forward?
Pause. I started talking to my grandmother's portrait. I know that sounds foolish, but late at night, when the house creaked and settled, I'd sit with her photograph and ask what she would do. One evening, I swear I could hear her voice saying, "Child, magic isn't a burden. It's a gift that grows when you share it."
That's when you began to envision the bed and breakfast concept?
Not immediately. First, I had to deal with some practical concerns. The house's foundation needed extensive work, and several portals were unstable. The one leading to the futuristic city kept flickering on and off. I spent my entire teacher's retirement savings on structural repairs before I could even think about guests.
Were there moments when you doubted your decision? That must have been isolating, having to keep such secrets from your family.
It was the loneliest period of my life, Tony. I'd always been close to my sister, but how do you explain that you're late for dinner because you were having tea with elves? The weight of keeping these discoveries secret was almost unbearable.
What changed? How did you move from isolation to creating this remarkable business?
The turning point came when I met my first accidental guest. Mrs. Henderson from the village got lost during a storm and knocked on my door. While I was making her tea, she wandered into the library and disappeared through the portal. I found her 3 hours later, sitting by a fountain in the medieval realm, chatting with local merchants about herb gardens.
How did she react to her interdimensional journey?
Chuckling. She looked at me and said, "Dear, this is the most interesting afternoon I've had in 30 years. Do you suppose I could come back next Tuesday?" That's when I realized these portals weren't just my burden to bear. They were experiences that could bring wonder back into people's lives.
So, Mrs. Henderson became your first official guest?
She became my partner, actually. She helped me understand that what I was offering wasn't just accommodation, but transformation. People our age, Tony, we've lived long enough to appreciate real magic when we encounter it.
Maya, we've been talking about the magical aspects of your grandmother's house, but I have a feeling there's something deeper here. Something about family legacy that you haven't shared yet.
Long pause, you're perceptive, Tony. Yes, there's more. After I'd been running the bed and breakfast for about 6 months, I found something that changed everything I thought I knew about my grandmother.
What did you find?
A journal, hidden behind a loose stone in what used to be the root cellar. The pages were old, some of them crumbling, but the writing was unmistakably hers. She'd been documenting her experiences with the portals for decades.
Decades? So she knew about them all along?
Not just knew about them, Tony. She'd been their guardian. The keeper of the thresholds, she called herself in the journal. She wrote about visitors from other dimensions who would come through, lost souls who needed guidance back to their own worlds.
That must have been overwhelming to discover. How did that make you feel about her silence when you were growing up?
Angry at first. Hurt. I remember sitting on that cellar floor, reading entry after entry about these incredible experiences she'd had, these responsibilities she'd carried. And I kept thinking, why didn't she tell me? Why did she let me believe she was just this eccentric old woman who lived alone in a crumbling house?
Did her journal give you any answers to those questions? An escape rather than a responsibility. That's a profound distinction.
She knew me better than I knew myself, Tony. She wrote that I needed to find my own strength first, my own sense of purpose. The portals weren't meant to be a way to run away from problems. They were meant to be a way to help others solve theirs.
And do you think she was right about that?
Pause. I do. If she'd told me about them during my darkest period, I probably would have walked through one of those portals and never come back. I was so desperate to be anywhere but where I was.
But by the time you inherited the house, you were in a different place emotionally?
I was. The inheritance came at a moment when I was finally ready to rebuild, rather than just escape. I'd already done the hard work of confronting my failures, my disappointments. I was looking for something to pour myself into, not something to disappear into.
Her journal must have revealed other things too. What else did you learn about her experiences?
She wrote about the responsibility weighing on her, especially in her later years. There were dimensional travelers who'd become stuck in our world, people from medieval times who couldn't adapt to modernity, future dwellers who found our era too primitive to navigate.
How did she help them?
Sometimes she could guide them back to the right portal, but other times she had to help them build new lives here. She wrote about a woman from a parallel Renaissance who became a master craftsperson, selling her work as historical reproductions. A man from a world where technology had evolved differently, who became a brilliant but eccentric inventor.
So she was running her own kind of interdimensional assistance program.
Exactly. And doing it all alone, Tony. The isolation she must have felt, carrying these secrets, helping these people with no one to share the burden with. It broke my heart to read about it.
Did that change how you thought about your own approach to the bed and breakfast?
Completely. I realized I'd been focused on the wonder of it all, the adventure and excitement for the guests, but I hadn't fully grasped the deeper purpose. My grandmother wasn't just managing portals. She was facilitating healing.
Healing, in what sense?
Think about it, Tony. Every person who books a stay here is looking for something they can't find in their regular life. Adventure, yes, but also perspective. Peace. A chance to see themselves differently.
And the dimensional travelers coming through the other way?
They're often refugees, in a sense, fleeing something in their own world, whether it's war, persecution, or just the feeling that they don't belong. The portals give them options, chances for new beginnings.
That's an enormous responsibility to take on.
It is. And reading her journal made me realize I needed help. I couldn't do what my grandmother did, carrying it all alone. That's when I started reaching out to others, building the network of guides and translators and cultural liaisons that make the bed and breakfast really work.
Tell me about that decision. It must have been difficult to break your grandmother's pattern of secrecy.
Terrifying, honestly. The journal was very clear about the dangers of exposure, of too many people knowing about the portals. But I also read between the lines, Tony. I saw how the isolation had worn her down, how much she'd sacrificed to keep the secret.
What gave you the courage to trust others with it?
One particular journal entry. She wrote about watching me as a child, how I'd always been drawn to bringing people together, how I'd had a gift for making strangers feel welcome. She said she hoped that if I ever inherited the responsibility, I'd find a way to do it that honored my nature, rather than fighting against it.
She was giving you permission to do things differently.
She was. But there was something else in that entry that really stuck with me. She wrote that her biggest regret wasn't keeping the secret from the world. It was keeping it from the people she loved. From me, from my mother, from anyone who might have understood and shared the burden.
That must have been painful to read.
It was. But also liberating. Because it meant that when I made the choice to trust my core team, to bring them into the full truth of what we were doing, I was honoring both her wisdom and her regrets.
How do you think she would feel about what you've built?
Long pause. I think she'd be amazed, Tony, and maybe a little envious. She wrote so often about wishing she could share the wonder of it all with someone who would understand. The bed and breakfast isn't just a business. It's a community of people who've been touched by magic and chosen to protect and share it responsibly.
Do you ever feel her presence in the house?
Every day. Not in a supernatural sense necessarily, though with all the dimensional energy flowing through the place, who knows? But I feel her in the choices I make, in the way I approach each guest and each situation. Her journal didn't just give me information, Tony. It gave me a moral compass for this work.
That's a beautiful legacy to carry forward.
It is. And it's still evolving. Every month I discover something new about the portals, about the worlds they connect to, about the responsibility we have to be good stewards of these impossible gifts. My grandmother started something extraordinary. I'm just grateful I get to continue it.
Maya, we've talked about the magical discoveries, the portal network, the early guests, but I sense there's something deeper here. What did you find when you really started digging into your grandmother's past?
Long pause. Tony, that's when everything changed. I thought I knew Grandma Rose. Sweet old lady who made the best apple pie in 3 counties. But when I found her journals hidden behind a false wall in the library, I realized I'd been living with a stranger my entire life.
Her journals revealed something unexpected?
She'd been the keeper of these portals for over 60 years, Tony. 60 years. And before her, it was her mother. And before that, her grandmother. This wasn't some recent magical awakening. This was a legacy stretching back centuries, and I was completely in the dark.
How did that make you feel, learning you'd inherited not just a house, but a responsibility you never knew existed?
Betrayed at first. Angry. Here I was, fumbling around trying to figure out why doors led to enchanted forests. And she could have prepared me, could have taught me. Instead, she let me stumble through it like some kind of test.
But there must have been reasons for her silence.
Oh, there were reasons. Page after page of them in her careful handwriting. She wrote about watching her own mother age rapidly from the strain of managing the portals, about seeing keepers in previous generations lose themselves entirely to the other worlds, abandoning their human lives completely.
She was protecting you from that fate.
She thought she was. Her plan was to let the portals close naturally when she died. To let the magic fade and give me a normal life. But Tony, the deeper I read, the more I understood. The portals don't just close, they collapse. And when they collapse, they take pieces of both worlds with them.
That sounds catastrophic.
It would have been. Entire communities on the other side depend on the stability these connections provide. And here, in our world, the magical overflow has been quietly healing the land around the estate for generations. The reason our local forests are so unusually vibrant, why the soil is so rich, why people feel drawn to visit this area.
So, by trying to protect you, she would have unknowingly caused tremendous harm.
Exactly. And reading her later entries, I could see she was starting to realize this herself. The guilt was eating her alive, Tony. She was caught between protecting me and protecting countless others, and she couldn't find a way to do both.
How did that change your understanding of the inheritance?
Pause. I stopped seeing it as a burden and started seeing it as a calling. But more than that, I began to understand the weight she'd carried alone all those years. Every decision about who could cross over, every portal that needed repair, every crisis that arose between worlds. She handled it all by herself.
Is that why you chose to turn it into a bed and breakfast, rather than just maintaining the portals quietly?
Partly, yes. I realized that isolation was what had worn down previous keepers. They became gatekeepers instead of bridge builders. But I also found something else in those journals that changed everything.
What was that?
Guest books, Tony. From the 1940s through the 1970s. Grandma Rose hadn't always been a solitary keeper. She'd run something very much like what I'm doing now. She'd welcomed visitors, facilitated exchanges, created genuine connections between worlds.
What made her stop?
Fear. After my grandfather died, she became terrified of losing anyone else she cared about to the dangers of interdimensional travel. So she closed it all down, took everything on herself, and spent the last 30 years of her life essentially imprisoned by her own protective instincts.
That must have been a profound realization.
It broke my heart, honestly. Reading her early entries, she was so full of wonder and joy about the connection she was fostering. People finding healing in the crystal caves of Athros, or learning agricultural techniques from the farming communes in the pastoral dimensions. She was creating magic in the truest sense.
And you decided to honor that earlier vision rather than her final wishes.
I decided to honor who she really was, not who grief and fear had made her become. Tony, in her last entry just a week before she passed, she wrote something I'll never forget. She said she hoped whoever inherited this responsibility would be braver than she'd been, would find a way to share the wonder instead of hoarding it out of fear.
It sounds like you've done exactly that.
I hope so. But understanding her story taught me something crucial about this work. It's not just about managing portals or running a business. It's about legacy, about how we choose to pass on both gifts and responsibilities to the next generation. I won't make her mistake of keeping secrets, but I also won't ignore the very real dangers she was trying to protect me from.
Maya, we've talked about the portals, the guests, the incredible success of your interdimensional bed and breakfast, but there's something in your voice when you mention your grandmother that makes me think there's more to this inheritance than you initially let on.
Long pause. You're very perceptive, Tony. I suppose I've been dancing around the real truth because it still feels impossible to say out loud.
Take your time. What haven't you told me about your grandmother?
She didn't die, Tony. At least, not in the way I thought she had.
I'm not sure I follow.
When I was cleaning out what I thought was her bedroom, I found journals. Decades of them. The handwriting changed over the years, but the signature was always the same. Eleanor Whitmore, my grandmother's name.
How many decades are we talking about?
The oldest journal I found was dated 1847. Tony, my grandmother was born in 1920.
That's not possible.
That's what I told myself. But then I kept finding things. Photographs of her with people in Victorian dress, a marriage certificate from 1869, and then another one from 1923, and another from 1967.
Maya, what are you saying?
I'm saying my grandmother had been using those portals for over a century. She wasn't just the owner of a house with magical doorways. She was a traveler, Tony. She'd lived entire lifetimes in different worlds, different times.
But you said she passed away. You inherited the house.
I thought she had died. The lawyers contacted me, said she'd left everything to me in her will. But 3 months after I opened the bed and breakfast, she walked through the front door.
She walked through the front door.
Just like that. Looking exactly as I remembered her from my childhood, not a day older. She smiled at me and said, "I see you figured out what to do with my little secret."
How did you react?
I dropped a tray of teacups, shattered china everywhere. Then I sat down on the floor and laughed until I cried. What else do you do when your supposedly dead grandmother shows up to check on your interdimensional hotel business?
What did she tell you about where she'd been?
She'd been living in a world where time moves differently. What felt like 6 months to her had been 2 years here. She said she'd been watching through the portals, proud of how I'd turned her retirement project into something wonderful.
Retirement project?
Apparently, she'd spent over a century helping people find their way between worlds, sometimes rescuing those who got lost, sometimes guiding others who needed a fresh start somewhere new. The bed and breakfast was supposed to be her way of stepping back, letting the portals serve a gentler purpose.
And she just handed that responsibility over to you?
Not exactly handed over. She said I'd chosen it myself the moment I decided to welcome strangers into the house, instead of sealing up the portals. She'd been hoping I would. But she couldn't force it.
Is she still? Does she live at the house now?
She visits. Sometimes she'll spend a few weeks helping with difficult guests or portal maintenance. Other times she'll disappear for months, exploring new worlds or checking on old friends scattered across dimensions.
How has this changed your understanding of everything you've built?
It made me realize I'm not just running a business, Tony. I'm continuing a family legacy I never knew existed. Every guest who finds exactly what they need in another world. Every person who comes back transformed by their experience. My grandmother was doing this long before I was born.
Do you feel the weight of that responsibility?
Some days. But mostly I feel grateful. I spent my whole life thinking I was ordinary, that I'd never do anything meaningful. Now I understand that I come from a line of people who've dedicated their lives to helping others find wonder.
Has she told you how long she expects you to do this?
That's the beautiful thing, Tony. She said it's not about obligation. The house chooses its keeper. If someday I need to move on, it will find someone else. Maybe another family member I don't even know about yet.
But for now, you're content to be the keeper of interdimensional doorways.
More than content. I finally understand why I never felt like I belonged in the regular world. This is what I was meant to do. Help people discover that there are always more possibilities than we think. More worlds to explore than we ever imagined.
And your grandmother approves of your methods?
She laughed when she saw my guest reviews online. Said she'd never thought of charging admission to wonder. But if it meant more people could experience magic safely, then I was smarter than she'd ever been.
Maya, I have to ask about something that's been puzzling me. Your grandmother's journal mentions she built the bed and breakfast 60 years ago, but you said the portals were already there when you inherited the house.
Long pause, you're very observant, Tony. I wondered when someone would notice that inconsistency.
So what's the real story? Was your grandmother running interdimensional vacations in the 1960s?
She was. The whole crumbling, abandoned house story? That was what we told the outside world. Grandma Rose operated the most exclusive travel business you could imagine for decades.
Wait, so when you inherited it, you already knew about the portals?
I grew up spending summers there, Tony. I thought every child had tea parties with fairy queens and learned sword fighting from medieval knights during family visits.
This changes everything. You weren't some accidental discoverer. You were trained for this.
Grandma Rose started teaching me the business when I turned 16. How to maintain the portal stability, which dimensions were safe for tourists, how to handle the more challenging guests from both sides.
Both sides? You mean the interdimensional visitors come here too?
Where do you think elves go for their honeymoons, Tony? They love our world's beaches. And don't get me started on how fascinated the steampunk dimension folks are with our coffee shops.
So why the elaborate story about discovering everything by accident?
Sighs. Because Grandma Rose made me promise to test the modern world's readiness. She said if I presented it as a magical discovery, people would accept it easier than if I announced a family business spanning 6 decades.
That's incredibly wise. People love the idea of stumbled-upon magic more than inherited responsibility.
Exactly. But there's something else, Tony. Something I haven't told anyone yet.
I'm listening.
The house isn't just a portal hub. It's an anchor point. Without someone from our bloodline maintaining it, all those dimensions start drifting apart. Grandma Rose wasn't just running a bed and breakfast. She was holding the fabric of reality together.
And now that responsibility falls to you.
Every single day. Which is why I really needed this business to succeed, Tony. It's not just about profit or adventure tourism. If I fail, entire worlds lose their connections to each other forever.
Maya, we've covered so much ground today, but I sense we're approaching something crucial. What was going through your mind as you prepared for what sounds like a final confrontation?
Long pause. You know, Tony, there comes a moment when you realize you can't keep running from responsibility. The portals were becoming unstable. Guests were stranded in 3 different dimensions, and I had Grandma's journal spread across my kitchen table at 2 a.m.
That must have been overwhelming. How do you prepare for something no guidebook could ever cover?
I kept thinking about what my grandmother wrote in her final entry. She said the house chooses its guardian, but the guardian must choose to accept the burden. I'd been playing innkeeper, but I hadn't truly accepted what that meant.
What did it mean, in your understanding?
It meant stopping the collector wasn't just about saving my guests or even my house. The entire network was at risk. Thousands of years of careful balance between worlds, and it was unraveling because I'd been too afraid to claim my full inheritance.
Your full inheritance being more than just the property itself?
Much more. Grandma wasn't just a caretaker, Tony. She was a guardian, capital G. The magic that flows through those portals, it needs an anchor, a conscious will to guide it. I'd been using the house's systems without understanding I was supposed to be part of them.
How did that realization change your approach?
Softly, I stopped trying to fix everything from the outside. That night, I went down to the basement, to the original portal where it all began. I placed my hands on those ancient stones, and finally listened instead of trying to control.
What did you hear?
The house was scared, Tony. 500 years of protecting these doorways, and suddenly it had to face something designed, specifically to corrupt that protection. The collector hadn't just stumbled into our network. He'd been studying it, learning its weaknesses.
So this became personal in a way you hadn't expected?
Exactly. It wasn't Maya the innkeeper versus some interdimensional threat anymore. It was the newest guardian, learning to wield centuries of accumulated power, standing up to someone who wanted to turn that power into a weapon.
And you felt ready for that responsibility?
Ready? No. But willing? Finally, yes. Sometimes courage isn't about feeling prepared, Tony. Sometimes it's about accepting that you're the only one who can act.
Maya, when you realized the Threshold Council was planning to shut down the portals permanently, what went through your mind?
Long pause terror, honestly. Not just for the business, but for all the connections we'd built. The friendships across dimensions, the cultural exchanges. They wanted to sever everything because of one rogue portal.
The medieval realm where the plague had broken through.
Exactly. And I understood their concern, Tony. A dimensional plague could devastate multiple worlds. But their solution was like burning down a library, because one book had termites.
How did you prepare for that final confrontation with the Council?
I spent 3 nights barely sleeping, walking through each portal, talking to the inhabitants, the crystal beings in the ice realm, the scholars in the floating city, even the dragons in the fire dimension. I needed to understand what we'd all lose.
You were gathering more than information, weren't you?
Quietly, I was saying goodbye in case I failed. Each world had become part of my heart. The singing forests, the upside-down waterfalls, the cities made of light. How do you let go of wonder like that?
But you also had a plan.
Grandmother's journal mentioned something called the Harmony Protocol, a way to stabilize all portals simultaneously by linking them through a central anchor point. The house itself could become that anchor, but it required.
Required what, Maya?
Pause, a permanent guardian. Someone who would bond with the house's magical foundation, never able to leave the property again. Essentially, a willing prisoner in exchange for keeping the portals open.
And you were prepared to make that sacrifice?
I was 58, Tony. My traveling days were behind me anyway. If I could spend my remaining years ensuring others could explore infinite worlds, it seemed like a fair trade.
What did you tell yourself that final morning before meeting the Council?
Soft laugh. I remembered something Grandmother used to say. Magic isn't about power, it's about connection. The Council saw the portals as dangerous tools to be controlled. I saw them as bridges between hearts and minds.
You walked into that meeting carrying the hopes of multiple dimensions.
And terrified I'd disappoint them all. But sometimes, Maya, the biggest changes require the biggest risks.
Indeed they do. What happened when you faced the Council? Maya, we're at the moment when everything could have collapsed. The portals were destabilizing, guests were trapped across dimensions. What was going through your mind?
Long pause. I kept hearing my grandmother's voice, Tony. Not literally, but she'd always said the house chose its keeper, not the other way around. Standing there, watching reality tear apart, I finally understood what she meant.
The house was testing you?
More than that. I'd been so focused on managing the portals, controlling them like some kind of interdimensional hotel manager. But they were never meant to be controlled. They were meant to be understood.
How did that realization change your approach?
I stopped fighting the chaos and started listening to it. Each portal has its own rhythm, its own needs. The medieval realm was calling out because its people were facing a plague. The crystal dimension needed our world's music to heal a broken harmony. I'd been treating symptoms instead of understanding the connections.
So you made a choice that went against everything the authorities wanted.
The Interdimensional Council demanded I shut everything down permanently. They said I was too dangerous, too unpredictable. But Tony, there were people depending on these connections now. Families split across worlds, communities that had formed around the exchanges.
That must have been terrifying, defying beings with that kind of power.
Pause. You know what scared me more? The thought of my granddaughter growing up in a world where we'd chosen fear over wonder, where we'd had the chance to bridge worlds and decided it was too risky.
Your granddaughter?
She was there that day, visiting for her birthday. 8 years old, watching me decide between safety and possibility. I realized this wasn't just about honoring my grandmother's legacy anymore. It was about what kind of legacy I'd leave.
What did you tell the council?
I said the portals would stay open, but we'd do it right. Not as a business, but as a trust. A responsibility passed down through generations, like the house itself.
And the consequences of that defiance?
Soft laugh. That's when the real magic happened, Tony. When you stop trying to own something miraculous and start serving it instead, it transforms you. The house, the portals, everything. They became something entirely new.
Something the council hadn't expected.
Something none of us had expected.
Maya, you're standing at the crossroads now. The council wants to shut down the portals permanently. What's going through your mind?
Long pause. You know, Tony, I keep thinking about what my grandmother would say. She protected these doorways for decades, never telling anyone.
But she also left them to you. That has to mean something.
It means the choice was always supposed to be mine, wasn't it? She could have sealed them herself or passed them to the council.
So, what does your heart tell you?
That magic without wonder is just power. These portals, they've changed people. Mrs. Henderson found courage in that medieval realm. The Johnsons reconnected in the enchanted forest. There will always be risks, Tony. But I've learned something running this place. Trust isn't about eliminating danger. It's about believing people can handle the extraordinary responsibly.
So you're keeping them open?
I'm keeping them open. But with new safeguards, new training. We're not hiding magic anymore, Tony. We're teaching people to respect it.
Maya, sitting here now, what strikes you most about this whole journey?
Long pause. The silence, Tony. When I first walked into grandmother's house, the silence felt like abandonment. Now it feels like possibility waiting.
That's beautifully put. What would you tell someone who's afraid to step through their own metaphorical doorway?
Fear and wonder often wear the same face. I spent 62 years believing magic was something you read about, not something you inherit. Chuckles softly, grandmother always said the house would know when I was ready.
Do you think she planned all of this?
I think she planted seeds, Tony. The rest was up to me. Some mornings I still can't believe guests are having breakfast with dragons, then returning home to tell their grandchildren about it.
What's next for the Crossroads Inn?
Smiles tomorrow, a retired teacher from Ohio wants to study astronomy in a realm where time moves differently. Next week, a couple celebrating their 50th anniversary in a world where autumn never ends.
Ordinary magic.
The very best kind.
So Maya, as we wrap up, what would you tell someone who just inherited their own impossible legacy?
Soft laugh. Don't run from the mystery, Tony. I almost sold this place 3 times in those first months.
What stopped you?
The guests. Watching a retired teacher discover she could speak to dragons, or seeing a widower find peace in those ethereal gardens. This house doesn't just connect dimensions. It connects people to parts of themselves they'd forgotten.
Your grandmother knew this would happen, didn't she?
I think she hoped. She left me more than a house. She left me a purpose. Every morning I wake up, and 40 different worlds are just waiting beyond those doors.
Any regrets about the quiet life you left behind?
Pa's quiet was never really living, was it? Besides, interdimensional bed and breakfast management is surprisingly similar to regular hospitality. You just need better insurance.
And what's next for the Waypoint House?
Whatever walks through those portals tomorrow, Tony. Whatever magic decides to stay for breakfast.